Um, Welcome all. For those of you who I've not yet had the pleasure to meet or say hello to, my name is Adriana Link, and I am the Assistant Director of Library and Museum Programming here at the American Philosophical Society. And I'm so happy to welcome you both in person and online. Hello, everyone online. To today's program, A Revolutionary Friendship, Washington, Jefferson, and the American Republic, featuring Frank Cogliano. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. And we wish to acknowledge their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, forced removal, and persecution of their languages and cultural traditions. The Society also recognizes that it has benefited from being an occupant of this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. Who's been here before? Wow, most of the room. Okay, still, I'm going to tell you that the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 to support the promotion of useful knowledge. We are a membership society, and election to membership honors those who have made significant contributions to the sciences, the arts, and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million of research funds to scholars who are working on projects that span all of those topics I've already mentioned. And our library and museum, which is right across the street, and also I'll say, just a pause, if you haven't yet gone to Sketching Splendor, which is our current museum exhibition, it is fantastic. So if you're not doing anything this afternoon, please go across the street and check it out. It's free, it's amazing. Please go. But in addition to our museum, we do have research centers and collections at our library that serve scholars across the globe. And as always, please do keep tabs on our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we're doing. And we do have a mailing list now, so if you didn't see, we have little cards at the front at registration, so you can sign up to learn about so many of the things that are going on here at the Society. Today's program, however, is sponsored by the David Center for the American Revolution, which is a collaboration between the David Library and the American Philosophical Society, and dedicated to supporting scholarship on the American Revolution. Following the vision of the David Library's founder, Saul Feinstone, the center champions the active engagement of scholars, educators, and the general public of all ages in continuing the dynamic encounter with this most central episode in the creation of the American nation. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to more programming as we gear up to 2026, so stay tuned for more events. A reminder, too, for those of you who are actively working on projects, that the David Center is currently accepting proposals for its 2024-2025 seminar series. The deadline for that is May 31st, so you have a little bit more time, but don't dally too long. Get those proposals in. We'd love to hear what you're working on. So with that, I'm very delighted to introduce today's speaker, Frank Cogliano. Francis D. Cogliano is Professor of American History at the University of Edinburgh and Acting Director of the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and co-host of the American History podcast, The Whiskey Rebellion. He is author of Emperor of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson's Foreign Policy, as well as the topic of today's lunch, A Revolutionary Friendship, Washington, Jefferson, and the American Republic. And we do have a few copies for sale at the back at the end of our lecture if you'd like to purchase one and get it signed by Frank, as well as some of our other titles from past programs. So it's a great time. Dads and grads, I hear it's a thing. Buy a book. We've got lots for sale. But with that, I think I will stop talking and turn things over to Frank. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Adriana. It's a great pleasure to be here. Some of you will have heard me say this before if you've ever heard me speak here in the United States, but I will say it anyway. I need to apologize because whenever I'm introduced, there's a kind of sort of frisson of excitement when they say, oh, he's from the University of Edinburgh. And that's followed inevitably by deflation and disappointment when you hear me speak. I am not Scottish, but I'm Scottish adjacent. I've spent a long time in Scotland. It's a great pleasure to be here because Adriana said in her kind introduction, I'm presently working at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and I'm spending the academic year there. I've been there since last July, and I'm returning to Scotland this summer. Charlottesville can be a little bit of a Thomas Jefferson theme park, so it's really nice to be here in an institution founded by Benjamin Franklin in a different commonwealth where I can breathe freely and speak my mind about Thomas Jefferson and others. So it's really great to be here. And what I want to do today is talk to you about my new book, A Revolutionary Friendship. And this book began with two questions. A question from a student. So one of my students in Edinburgh a few years ago, more years than I care to remember. I worked on this book for much longer than I anticipated. My son is a project manager, and he's told me, if you had a project manager, you would have finished this 3 years earlier. I didn't, so I didn't. So I've been working on this for a while, and it began with a student question. A student in one of my courses came up to me at the end of the class and said, what was the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? And I gave her what was basically the textbook answer, which is, well, they're both Virginians and they had a lot in common, but they disagreed over fundamental political matters, and we all know they were estranged at the end of Washington's life. And basically, they didn't get along very well because they disagreed over politics, and they represent two kind of very different visions of the future of the United States. So they kind of represent the kind of two strands of the American Revolution. And there's a lot of merit to this. And it's the kind of, if you will, the textbook answer. It's certainly an answer I've written. But I got back to my office and I thought, I wonder if that's actually true. Second question. Well, I said, I wonder if that's true. Maybe that would be a good topic for a book. Not realizing how long it would take me to write this book. I thought, oh, that'll be a quick book. Second question came from my wife, who's here today. And she said, surely there's a book on that already. The subtext, because she's not a historian, but she spends a lot of time around historians, she's got views. The subtext to that question was, do we really need a book on this? And if one works on famous individuals, and you don't get more famous in this period than these two, you really have to ask yourself, do we need another book on them? My answer to you, I would suggest, is we do, because seeing them in relation to each other does change our perspective. It certainly changed my perspective. So beginning with those two questions, what was the relationship, and really do we need this, I started this project. And my methodology isn't revolutionary. I know there are colleagues from the academy in this room, fellow historians in this room, and I don't think they're going to be shocked by this. What I did was, this is the real revelation here, I went back and I read the primary sources in order. But I started at the beginning. I didn't start with their estrangement, because Washington and Jefferson were estranged late in Washington's life, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But my argument to you, one of the things I would suggest to you today, is that's colored our understanding of their relationship. They knew each other for at least 30 years. I say at least because I actually think there's something of a question about when they first met, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in going back to the beginning and focusing on their correspondence, but not exclusively on their correspondence, but reading the primary sources forward from the 1760s forward to Washington's death and beyond, and trying to ignore what I thought I knew about the period, which is very hard, I was able to, I think, reach a new understanding of that relationship and hopefully share some insights into that relationship, which I want to discuss with you today. Now, they knew each other for 30 years or 30 plus years. What I'm going to do today, I want to allow time for questions, is kind of briefly skip through key points in their relationship to illustrate what I think are the main themes of the book. But as I said, I'm happy and indeed eager to take your questions at the end, so I'll leave some time for that. So there are a series of dates I want to kind of stop at. 1768, when I believe they first met. 1790, when Jefferson joined Washington's cabinet. I realize there's a small matter of the American Revolution between those two dates. I'll say something about that as well. 1797, when they really did fall out. And then I want to look at Jefferson's efforts to get right with Washington after Washington's death. Washington dies in 1799, and Jefferson, there are kind of two key dates there, 1801 and 1814, that I want to stop at to consider Jefferson's efforts to effectively get right with Washington after his death. So, 1768 or 9, Washington and Jefferson met, if one reads the main biographies, and this is not meant to be a criticism of their biographers, quite the contrary, in 1769, when they were both members of the Virginia House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. We could definitely put them together at that meeting of the House of Burgesses in May of 1769, which is a key moment in the history of the deterioration of relations between Britain and the colonies. We definitely know they were together in Williamsburg then. However, and this is where going back to the primary sources is useful, I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, I want to be clear about that, it seems pretty clear to me that they first met in 1768 in Williamsburg while the House of Burgesses was meeting. Washington was a member of the House of Burgesses in 1768. Jefferson was not. But they were both at the theater at the same time in mid-May 1768. We know this because Washington was a pretty good diarist and that he kept a diary consistently. He's not a great diarist and that he's terribly interesting. He's not Samuel Pepys. But he keeps a diary consistently, although his entries are quite terse. We know he was at the theater on that day. We also know, because Jefferson kept very good records of his spending, his outgoings in particular, and we have his memorandum books, that he was at the theater in Williamsburg on the same day. So I'm pretty confident that they were in the theater, perhaps sitting in an audience like this, at the same time. Now, does it matter? Probably not. Except it's a reminder that these guys weren't just sort of going around being founding fathers and doing founding fathery things all the time. Both of them loved the theater. And both of them were avid theater goers throughout their lives. And so it's quite fitting that this would be their first encounter. The other thing it reminds us is to treat context seriously. In 1768, Washington was already a very famous person. He was certainly the most famous person in Virginia at that time. He's one of the most famous people in America. Although because we're here, Franklin's more famous in 1768. Just to be clear, Jefferson's not famous at all. Jefferson's 11 years younger than Washington. He's a young man. He's not yet held political office. And so if they were both at the theater at the same time, and they're both representatives, of course, of their elite class, they're both great planters, they would have been aware of each other, I think. Jefferson would certainly have been aware of Washington's presence. Everybody in that room would have been aware of Washington's presence. Jefferson, on the other hand, may or may not have attracted Washington's notice. So they're in the same room at the same time. I can put them in the same room at the same time. Whether they interacted or not, don't know. But I think it does. It tells us this tells us a couple of things. It tells us, I think, to go back to the sources, but also to question our assumptions about what we think we know. But also not to push it too far. I don't think they sort of necessarily they weren't spending a night at the theater together. I think it was a coincidence. So, in terms of the arc of their relationship, over the next 10 to 15 years, the years that coincide with the resistance to Britain, the growing resistance to Britain and the outbreak of the war in 1775 and the War of Independence, what we see is Washington and Jefferson go from being essentially acquaintances to political allies to friends. And I want to kind of quickly go through this. So early on, they've got a lot in common. As I said, they're large plantation owners. They own a lot of land. They're enslavers. They belong to the same social class. They marry wealthy widows named Martha. At one point, I had a working title for this book, which was Too Many Marthas, because there were just so many Marthas to keep track of at one point. So they've got superficial things in common, and they've got kind of deeper things in common. But they're not terribly close. But politics starts to bring them together. They're both opponents and critics of British rule. And during the increasingly intense imperial crisis, they both are kind of radicals, at least by the standards of colonial Virginia, late colonial Virginia. And when the war comes, they're both fervent supporters of the Patriot movement. They've got different skill sets, as you know. Washington's a soldier. Washington's going to go and command the Continental Army from 1775 to 1783. Jefferson is not inclined towards matters military. And Jefferson will serve as a statesman, and he will, of course, draft the Declaration of Independence, or be the main drafter of the Declaration of Independence, but he'll also devote his energies to redrafting the laws of Virginia after the Declaration of Independence. He says that's the real work of the Revolution, remaking society. He sees himself, he says, the lawgivers of ancient times would be jealous of us. We have a chance to begin the world anew. So he wants to go back and redraft the laws of Virginia. He serves a couple of terms as governor of Virginia, and I'll say something about that in a second. And they grow closer during the war, but still not terribly close. So what happens during the war is Washington corresponds with all the governors of all the states. And Washington's kind of administrative load was considerable. Just the number of letters he wrote or that his staff wrote on his behalf. It's really amazing. And they correspond a lot about defense matters when Jefferson is governor of Virginia. As some of you will know, when Jefferson is governor of Virginia, the British invade the state repeatedly. The War of Independence moved to Virginia, and that period coincides with Jefferson's terms as governor. The Virginia Constitution of 1776 created a very weak governor, so Jefferson had relatively limited authority to prepare to defend the state. In truth, it's the low point of his 50-year public career. He's not terribly effective as governor of Virginia, and he doesn't do a great job of marshaling the defenses of the state, and the British crisscross the state. Jefferson leaves office at the beginning of June 1781. Washington, of course, will triumph at Yorktown in October of 1781. So Jefferson's having his public low point at this point, and the House of Delegates, the post-revolutionary Assembly in Virginia, will launch an inquiry into his behavior as governor. He's ultimately vindicated, but he doesn't know that at the time. Washington, on the other hand, this is his moment of great triumph in 1781 after the surrender at Yorktown. What's interesting is Washington is quite generous and magnanimous to Jefferson at this point and writes to him and basically says, you did as well as you could. I know they're saying bad things about you, but you did quite well. And out of that wartime collaboration, a friendship blossoms. And indeed, I think the next phase of their friendship emerges during the 1780s. When Jefferson is mainly in France from 1784 to 1789, Washington and Jefferson correspond a lot. And they correspond about a variety of topics, not just matters political, agriculture, what's going on in the United States. They talk a little bit about political matters and political reform. Their views on the Constitution aren't as far apart as you might suspect, given what we think we know about them. And they become quite close. Washington asks Jefferson's advice about the Society of Cincinnati, for example. And the Society of Cincinnati was a kind of veterans organization for Revolutionary War officers, former Revolutionary War officers, Continental Army officers. And it is a hereditary society. And Jefferson's very worried that this might lead to the creation of a kind of American aristocracy, a military aristocracy. And he thinks that'll undermine the Republican government in the United States. And Washington asks Jefferson for his advice about this. And again, I think this is evidence of the strength and depth of their friendship that's finally evolved as it evolves and flowers during the 1780s. And my argument is Washington deliberately asked Jefferson because he knew he'd get a negative answer about this. He didn't ask one of the members of his so-called military family like Alexander Hamilton. More about him in a minute, don't worry. He asked Jefferson, and Jefferson says, you know what? This is fine if you want to have a veterans organization, but it shouldn't be hereditary. And Washington agrees with him. Now, ultimately, the Society of Cincinnati will vote. It's one of the few times in Washington's public life that people opposed him, because the Society of Cincinnati would vote for hereditary membership. But it's a small illustration of their burgeoning friendship during this period. Which leads me to 1790, when Jefferson joins Washington's cabinet. I want to talk to you about a fishing trip in a minute. And I want to talk to you about AI, which produced this image, in a minute. It's not quite there yet. I don't think the machines are necessary. They haven't quite got us, as will be evidenced by this image. Jefferson joins Washington's cabinet in the spring of 1790. He served as American minister in France until the end of 1789. He returned to Virginia in December of 1789. Washington nominated him to become Secretary of State, and again, I think this is testimony to the depth and strength of their friendship at this point, in the summer of 1789. In fact, he sent Jefferson's name, he submitted his name to the Senate for confirmation in September of 1789. Because Washington is asking people to do things. Washington is that clear. It's Franklin. I'm going to get struck by lightning. Is that it? Pregnant pause. Eat your lunches. So should I take that off? Right. Where was I? Oh, now I'm a crooner. Washington was not used to asking people to do things more than once, so he assumed that Jefferson would accept this invitation. Jefferson can be a little bit of a diva, and he doesn't accept the invitation right away. In fact, he says, well, I have to think about it, and I'd prefer to stay in France, and I'm doing better work here, and so on and so forth. So he doesn't give Washington a clear answer in the fall of 1789. And when Jefferson gets back to Virginia in December of 1789, James Madison comes to see him and says, look, you got to give him an answer. And Jefferson says, oh, does he really want me? So basically, Washington, either directly or indirectly, asked Jefferson 3 times to serve as Secretary of State, which again is testimony to what he thinks of Jefferson, because Washington was not a patient man. Jefferson eventually accepts. He goes to New York, then the capital of the United States, and so once he finally accepts, he says, yeah, but my daughter's getting married, and it's winter time, and so I'll get there when I get there. He gets there in May of 1790. He gets to New York City, then the capital of the United States. Here's where I want to tell you, and this is where going back to the sources is interesting, and I hope enlightening. I want to tell you about a fishing trip. Jefferson and Washington, if one reads their biographies, went fishing in June of 1790. The background to this is that Washington had a near fatal bout of pneumonia in May of 1790. It was widely believed he was going to die. They put straw out on Broadway in New York so that the carriages wouldn't make noise and disturb him while he was trying to rest. So it was a very, very serious moment. And in June of 1790, he invited Jefferson to go fishing. And as I say, biographies of both men report that they went fishing. There's a version of this story that has its origins in the early 20th century that suggests that Alexander Hamilton was on this trip as well. Yeah, right? So I read this, and I thought, okay, here's your story to start the book with, Frank. You need a colorful anecdote. This is the one. Except, it would have been great, right? It's like that Sopranos episode when 4 guys go out on the boat and 3 come back. You know, if Hamilton, Washington, and Jefferson are on a boat together fishing, what more could I want? Except it didn't happen. Jefferson, our evidence for this is a letter that Jefferson writes to his daughter. And he basically says, the president's asked me to go fishing. Jefferson hated sailing, hated it. He was prone to seasickness. He also suffered from migraines, very bad migraines, and he was suffering from migraine at that point. And he said to his daughter, well, I really hope the seasickness will cure my migraine. So he's not enthusiastic about this. As I said at the outset, he's a very meticulous record keeper. He keeps track of all his expenses. And we know that on, I think it's June 8th, 1790, he's in Manhattan buying strawberries, not fishing with George Washington. The papers reported that Washington was fishing at that point. So I'm both relieved, because I'm thinking I'm going to have to spend like a month doing research on what sport fishing was like in the 18th century in order to write this opening to the book. I no longer have to do that, except I'm crestfallen because I've lost this amazing anecdote to begin the book with. However, what I want to suggest to you all is that this too, and you might not want to go this far with me, but indulge me, that this too is evidence of their friendship. Because do you know what? Friends sometimes just invite each other to do stuff together. And sometimes if you're not feeling very well, you beg off and say, no, I'll get you next time. And so I don't think as biographers, and again, I'm not being critical of any particular biographers, I understand the appeal of this story. But I don't think that it was a portentous moment when the future of the American Republic was going to be determined. It's a bit like going to the theater all those years ago. I think Washington invited Jefferson to go fishing. This was the recommendation of his doctor as he was convalescing. Washington loved kind of outdoor pursuits, fishing, hunting, riding, and so on. So I think Washington was going to go fishing to convalesce. He invited his then friend, Thomas Jefferson, to go with him. Jefferson wasn't feeling very well. Having said yes, clearly his letter to his daughter suggests he's like, I don't really want to go. And then he just begged off and didn't go. Friends do that. I don't have any evidence for this, but beyond the fact that it didn't happen. But I think it's as plausible an explanation as any for this. And it's a reminder, I think, that Jefferson and Washington actually worked together quite productively for most, not all, for most of the time that Jefferson served in Washington's cabinet. So Jefferson served in Washington's cabinet as Secretary of State from April, May of 1790 until the end of December 1793 when he resigned. He resigned with effect from January 1st, 1794. And what happened was, as many of you will know, during Washington's presidency, certainly his first administration and going into much of his second administration, the two big issues that are facing the United States, at least in terms of national politics, are Hamilton's fiscal program, which Jefferson comes to oppose, Washington supports. There's no bridging that gap. And secondly, the French Revolution and how to respond to the French Revolution. Having looked pretty closely at the interactions between the two men, particularly where the French Revolution was concerned, because that was Jefferson's bailiwick as Secretary of State, they collaborate much more closely than, again, the textbooks would have you believe, or even Frank in his lectures prior to writing this book would have had you believe. They agree that the United States should be neutral in the wars of the French Revolution. Washington wants to lean towards the British. Jefferson wants to lean towards the French. That's not really a revelation. But they collaborate on they agree on the big issues about where the United States should situate itself. And they work together fairly productively. However, and they socialize a lot. They have breakfast a lot. Their correspondence dries up. There's a lot of correspondence during Jefferson's time in Washington's cabinet, but it's mostly correspondence that consists of, hey, I'll meet you tomorrow for breakfast, right? And we'll discuss this paper. Not detailed letters, because they're seeing each other on a regular basis, so they're eating breakfast together a lot. Jefferson keeps notes of a lot of these meetings. Washington does not, so we have Jefferson's view of things, which we have to read with care. But the documentary record is fairly rich for this period, although it's a little bit one-sided. But they're also doing things. They go see a new mechanical thresher here in Philadelphia after the Capitals moved to Philadelphia because they have a common interest in agriculture. Interestingly, and I'll say this as a sidebar, the one topic they almost never correspond about, slavery. Even though there's one letter late in their relationship when they're writing about free labor versus enslaved labor, but they don't. It's central to their lives, but they don't really correspond about that, and it's in the book. But that's an interesting aspect of this. However, what we see is they're fairly friendly and very convivial through much of the time that Jefferson serves in Washington's cabinet. Jefferson becomes disillusioned with the Federalists and ultimately leaves the cabinet, as I said, effective on January 1st, 1794. He blames Hamilton. Now, what you see here, by the way, this is an image that AI provided of the fishing trip. And so that's Jefferson, supposedly, on the left. Washington's not bad. The AI Washington is all right. And that's Hamilton on the right. I see the gentleman there shaking his head. If you know my university, the University of Edinburgh, he actually looks like William Robertson, the 18th century Scottish historian. But this is what AI came up with for this fishing trip. So as I said, I don't think AI is ready to take us over yet. I mean, wait for it, but so they work together reasonably well until this trio breaks up. And Jefferson and Hamilton really do come to loathe each other. And Jefferson can't accept that Washington agrees with Hamilton more than he does with him. At least that's what he comes to believe. And he says things like, well, he's getting old, he's getting feeble, and he becomes disillusioned with Washington somewhat in this period. Which brings me to their great breakup. Jefferson wrote a letter about Washington in 1796 that became infamous. And the timing's important here. So Jefferson left the Washington administration on January 1st, 1794. He then went into what he claimed was retirement. And in April of 1796, as a private citizen, he wrote a letter to an Italian friend, Filippo Mazzei, who used to live in Charlottesville and was one of Jefferson's neighbors, but was then back living in Italy. And Jefferson wrote him a letter, and it was a chatty letter that had lots of news about what was going on in the United States, including about politics. And in that letter, he wrote, I should give you a fever if I should name the apostates who have embraced these heresies, and the heresies he's talking about are kind of aligning with Britain in sympathy for the British. Men who were Solomons in the council and Samsons in combat. So Samsons in combat is a reference to George Washington, but whose hair has been cut by the harlot England. Samson, of course, lost his power when he lost his hair. This is not something I can identify with. Being so powerful, you see. And so this was a reference to Washington selling his soul to the harlot England. As insults go, including insults of the 18th century, this is pretty tame, actually. Nonetheless, it's an insult, and it's an insult about George Washington. Filippo Mazzei shared this letter, and colleagues in the room will know people shared letters all the time in the 18th century. So Jefferson should have known this was a danger. And Mazzei shared it with friends in Italy. So the letter was written in English. It's then translated into French. So it goes from English into French. It's shared in France. It goes viral, as the kids would say. And it's published in French in France. It's then retranslated into English and appears in the American newspapers in the spring of 1797. And the retranslation is slightly less charitable, so the harlot England becomes the whore England. So it's a translation that certainly doesn't favor Jefferson, and this is mortifying for him. But again, context matters. Jefferson, when he wrote that letter, was a private citizen. When it was published in the newspapers, he was the vice president of the United States. He ran for president against John Adams, of course, in 1796. He lost. as was the way back then. If you came second in the Electoral College, congratulations, you're the vice president. So he's now serving, that's a custom we ought to keep. He's now serving as the vice president of the United States when this letter about Washington, the most popular man in the country, now in retirement, he's now in retirement, appears. And Washington took offense and was furious. And this marked the end of their relationship. Jefferson writes to him, he writes once or twice more, and he sort of says, he tries to inquire about agriculture, and Washington just ghosts him. So that's the end, or at least that's the end as far as Washington is concerned. And so politics, which brought them together, also seemingly was the end for them. It's not the end for Jefferson. Washington died in December of 1799, so they never reconciled. They never had an opportunity to reconcile. I think we know, if you know the history of Jefferson's relationship with John Adams, they were estranged, and then they came together in old age and had that kind of flourishing correspondence in their last decades of their life. Maybe something like that could have happened had Washington lived a little longer. I don't know. But that opportunity never presented itself because Washington died in 1799, only a couple years after this letter appeared. Jefferson, however, lives until 1826. And he spends a lot of that time trying to get right with Washington. I've got two examples for you. One occurred in 1801. In January of 1801, Jefferson visited Washington's home at Mount Vernon, and he went to pay his respects to Martha Washington, George's widow. Now, what you need to know about Martha Washington is she can hold a grudge. George was thin-skinned, and Martha never forgot. And Martha did not like Thomas Jefferson at this point. She later told Federalist politicians, and so this is hearsay that comes after the fact, but it seems plausible to me, that the two worst days of her life, the worst day of her life was the day that George died, and the second worst day of her life was the day that Thomas Jefferson came to pay his respects. So that's one version of this. Jefferson's account, he wrote to one of his daughters, and he said, I visited Mrs. Washington. She sends her regards. He didn't comment on this. The reason this is suspicious, however, is Jefferson, of course, ran for president again in 1800. And the 1800 election was deadlocked in the Electoral College. And the outgoing Federalist-dominated House of Representatives would choose between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson who would become the next president of the United States. And that wasn't settled until February of 1801. So Jefferson is visiting Martha Washington and paying his respects at George Washington's tomb, something he hadn't done in the previous 13 months, just as Congress is getting ready to decide who to pick as the next president of the United States, Jefferson or Aaron Burr. Martha, perhaps not incorrectly, suspected that Jefferson wasn't entirely sincere or might have had an ulterior motive when he came to Mount Vernon. And certainly Federalist politicians made that an issue of that. We can discuss that if you want. Let's go forward. Jefferson, of course, was elected was inaugurated. The House of Representatives chose him. He was reelected in 1804. He served 2 terms as president, retires in 1809, lives another 17 years until he dies in 1826. During his retirement, he quite clearly, I suggest to you, tries to get right with Washington, and in a slightly more sincere way, I would suggest, than he did back in 1801. Because I don't think he has as explicit a political motive now. And Jefferson, once he calmed down a little bit, and after serving as president, he had a good sense of how difficult it was to be president, I think. He reflected on his relationship with Washington. He spent a lot of time in organizing his papers during his retirement, and he wrote and thought a lot about his relationship with Washington. And in 1814, he wrote to Walter Jones. Walter Jones was a political ally of his. He studied at William & Mary with him. He'd known Walter Jones for decades. And Jones was writing a history of the party controversies and disputes of the 1790s, and he was a political ally of Jefferson's. He was in Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. And he wrote to Jefferson and said, look, I'm trying to get right to the prehistory, the origins of our party. Can you tell me what Washington was like? And Jefferson, who's never a man of few words, I mean, he's not Hamiltonian. Hamilton is the man of all words. But Jefferson writes long letters and long accounts. Jefferson writes a 1,200-word essay on Washington, which is the longest single piece of writing either man left about the other one, and reflected on what he thought. And he wrote, I think I knew General Washington intimately and thoroughly. It may truly be said that never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great. For his was the singular destiny and merit of leading the armies of his country successfully through an arduous war, of conducting its councils through the birth of a government, and of scrupulously obeying its laws through the whole of his career, civil and military, of which the history of the world furnishes no other example. It's no longer Samson being shorn by the harlot England. Now, a very, very eminent scholar of this period, who's a very good friend of mine, but I will not name them, once said to me, Frank, look, the most important thing you need to know to understand Thomas Jefferson is that he lies. And I actually disagree with this. I think Jefferson comes from a culture that really values politeness and civility. And so he frequently keeps his counsel when he disagrees with people. So I think people leave conversations with him thinking they'd agreed when they hadn't necessarily. I think, and this is a flaw in a politician. But I don't think he's lying all the time. And I think this is a true account. And what I want to leave you with is kind of Jefferson's take on this. And accept it with skepticism if you want. Oh, here's the guy from Monticello. Of course he's saying this. But I think we need to take Jefferson at his word. I think in retirement and late in life, Hamilton's dead now, Washington's dead, Burr's doing his thing. Jefferson concludes, he makes the argument, and I think he means it. You know, we agreed on much more than we disagreed about. In the passions of the 1790s, we all kind of let it get to our heads, him especially. But now, with a bit of cool and reflection, we agreed on more than we disagreed. The big stuff we agreed on. And he goes to his grave saying that, and he's pretty consistent about that throughout his retirement. And a lot of scholars have looked at this and said, yeah, but that's because he's self-serving. And maybe, but I think we need to, with respect to my colleague, take him at his word in this particular case. If you read Washington's farewell address, the essay that he had published in 1796 announcing that he wasn't going to run for president, for a third term. And if you read Jefferson's first inaugural address, which is the address where he says we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, there's not much in either of those that either man would disagree with. And as kind of big statements of political principles, that's what both men are intending to make in those particular documents. So I want to leave you, before I start singing my second set with this, I want to leave you with a little bit of hope, because we're living in a time of a little bit of politics right now. You might not be aware, but if the internet's going to be huge. That sometimes the passions of the moment lead us to do and say things that maybe upon reflection we don't necessarily mean, and that we may have more in common than we think. So that's your lunchtime homily. But anyway, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So we have a couple of minutes so we can take a few questions, and I have a microphone, so I'll come to you. All right, I see you.
So I know enough about history to know that in the early presidential elections, the man who came in second became the vice president. But what I was wondering is, when you think about what goes on in an election today between two candidates, it's hard to imagine the loser never said anything bad or wrong. What, I mean, was there discomfort during the campaign for each where they were arguing politically?
Oh, yeah. Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
politics hasn't changed that much. Thank you. That's a very good question. And, one of the problems we have with the founding fathers and talking about the founders in this is we assume they all agree or they disagree, but these are, first of all, they're individuals. They have the same kind of range of personality quirks and peccadillos as we have. And sometimes people just don't like each other, and politics is a nasty business, or can be a nasty business. It's very nasty in the 1790s if one reads the newspapers and the pamphlets. So there are hurt feelings. It's one reason it took Jefferson and Adams a decade before they made up after the election of 1800, because things are said that are difficult to unsay. And Jefferson's, the Monticello letter is a good example of that. It's not terribly extreme, but Washington was very sensitive. So this kind of stuff is very, very common. These are not monolithic people. But thank you.
So we have a question online, and I see another here, so we'll go online first.
Thanks, Frank. So our question from online is, did Washington's relationship with Madison erode due to Madison's political influence over Jefferson?
That's really good. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, online individual. Washington's relationship with Madison is with Madison is very interesting because in many respects it was a deeper friendship than his with Jefferson during the 1790s because they collaborate really closely on the Constitution and on the need for constitutional reform. And they are really together in that. Jefferson's off stage in Paris at that point. And they drift apart, but they don't become estranged in the same way that Jefferson and Washington do. In part because Madison is much more disciplined in the kind of expressions he makes publicly and privately than Jefferson is. But I don't think that the Washington-Madison relationship is necessarily affected by the Washington-Jefferson relationship. It's its own thing. But it was closer at one point, certainly, than the Jefferson-Washington relationship was. But thanks for that.
I was just wondering, you observed that there was little in their correspondence about slavery, but in terms of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, in your knowledge and research, do you see that they had held their personal beliefs were very different, or were they the same, particularly with regard in the Constitution to counting the slaves as only a fraction of a human being?
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah, so there are 2 chapters in the books on slavery, even though they don't talk much about it with each other. And with regard to slavery, they each make a similar journey. I want to phrase this very carefully because it's actually a really tricky topic, and I want to try to be as clear as possible. They're both enslavers, and they both depend on slavery throughout their lives, and each of them enslaves hundreds of people. They each come to believe that slavery is wrong. They each do relatively little about that. Washington does more than Jefferson, and in terms of posterity, he's very aware of his reputation, and this is a very good move for him. He frees some of the slaves at Mount Vernon in his will. He is unable to free all of them because his wife Martha was a widow, and many of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon were enslaved people that she brought into their marriage, and he didn't have these so-called dower slaves. He was not able to free them. It's complicated, or the legal aspects are complicated, but Washington makes that step, and of course, it's kind of helped him with posterity. I'm working on these 2 individuals, but I work at Monticello. Boy, there was a Freudian slip, eh? And if you work on Jefferson, you talk about slavery a lot, and rightly so. In Washington studies, it's just not the same issue, in part because of this action he took posthumously, which is interesting. So both of them believe it's wrong, but both of them sort of say, well, what are we going to do about it? They both kind of struggle with it. They don't struggle so much that they do anything meaningful necessarily. Another key difference, and this gets to your point about the Constitution a little bit, is Washington does not seem to be as concerned about what a post-emancipation society would look like as Jefferson. The worst stuff Jefferson ever wrote are the things on race in the Notes on the State of Virginia, where he basically says, look, if we emancipate the slaves, black people and white people can't live together. Washington doesn't seem to hold those views. Washington thinks he's better than everybody. So, like, we can have black wage workers and white wage workers if we have a post-emancipation society. He's less troubled by what we would see as racism or scientific racism than Jefferson is. So there's a crucial difference there. As far as the Constitution goes, both of them as Virginians favor the 3/5 compromise because it's going to benefit Virginia as the largest state with the largest enslaved population. But thank you for that.
So we have time for maybe one more quick question.
Yeah, I'm happy to sign books, but we've got a train to catch as well, so there's a little bit of pressure. But anyway, but I would.
All right, I'll come over here. No, I
Oh.
So the question, if you didn't hear, was, did the Marthas know each other?
Got to get that train.
Well, on that note, thanks so much,
I've got to
Frank.
confess I don't know that, but I'll try to find out. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Please join me in thanking Frank for this great presentation.